talk about nostalgia a little bit. Nostalgia, we remember the good old days, Depending upon how old you are, it's, what are the good old days, right? So the good old days for some people are good grief. It's kind of sad nowadays. I look at some of the kids and they're born, in the 2000s, and it's like the good old days were 2001, 2002. I'm like, and I think of when I was growing up, I think of the good old days as the 70s and 80s, and I think, wow, that's the time, Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. And then some of you are like, what are you talking about? It's like 1950 something. And okay, well, the good old days, you define it how you want to, And I think of the World War II generation, and they had, they look back at the after post World War II, and they look at the 50s, and they say the good old days, muscle cars and poodle skirts, good stuff. And they look back with fondness, and we all do this. We all look back at a particular time in our lives with fondness, do we not? We do, okay? Unless you're super young, But if you go back into the 50s, or you still have, that's a kind of a glossed over view of history. You still had, post World War II, and you did have Korea, and you did have Vietnam, and you did have, polio still was some issues, and other types of diseases out there, and racial prejudice, and stagflation under Jimmy Carter, and gas lines, and the Cold War, and nuclear threats. So when we consider for a moment our history and a bit of a nostalgia, sometimes when we think back, when we think of the good old days, I don't know, maybe it's just we want to put a happy face on stuff. Maybe we're just the optimist that wants to say, it's okay. It's interesting for me because within the book of Hebrews, even in the book of Hebrews, we see that there is a recording of the Israelites, and they had a nostalgia when they came out of Egypt. They come out of Egypt, and they had a bit of a nostalgia because there they are in the wilderness, and times start to get a little bit tough. And when times start to get a little bit tough, they need to think of the good old days. And for them, the good old days, believe it or not, was Egypt. And they'd say, remember the leeks, and remember the garlic, and remember the fish we were able to take out of the Nile. But that's kind of a glossed over view of history, is it not? Consider, for example, the genocide and the slavery and the making of the bricks and the making the bricks without straw. Those are some small things that they're going to look over, are they not? So sometimes when we look at history, we look at our lives, and we do so with a distorted view, we have a problem. As we enter into the book of Hebrews, the audience which our author is writing to, he's writing to them because they're going through a tough time, and over and over again, he is exhorting them to be tough, to be a people who hold on, a people who have ongoing strength. These are a people who have, because of their decision to follow Jesus Christ, they have suffered financial, perhaps ruin. They have suffered socially. They are no longer welcome. Sometimes they are ostracized. These are people who have had to pay quite a bit. And there's the temptation when we are paying quite a bit, when there's times are tough, to look back to the good old days. Folks, the good old days, you can't go back. You can't go back. We need to, when we undergo difficulty, we need to be a people who understand that we can't look at history with rose-colored glasses and have our understanding tinted. We have to be a people who take a pros and cons look at stuff and say, let's be realistic, or as realistic as possible. We need to be a people who do not allow our nostalgia to rob us of our future blessing and even our current blessing. I want us to turn this morning, go to Hebrews chapter 5. In Hebrews chapter 5, the concept of the high priest of Jesus has been introduced already, but now as we come into the 5th chapter, we see much more explanation of Jesus as the high priest. And there's going to be even more of that in Hebrews chapter 7. But come to Hebrews chapter 5, we'll be looking at verses 1 through 10 this morning. And as we do so, again, our author is writing to answer this question. The people are asking themselves this: should they go back to the old ways? Maybe it is best for them to say, the Jesus thing was an interesting phase in our life, but maybe we need to go back to temple sacrifice. Maybe we need to go back and go to synagogue with mom and dad so everything is fine, to get a social life which would be back intact. Maybe we can get our jobs back. should we continue to follow Jesus. So come, Hebrews chapter 5, and we look here at the first 10 verses. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Again, Jesus as the great high priest, he has been introduced here. We saw that all the way back in chapter 4 and in verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest, and now we see here more of an explanation of the idea of the high priest. And so he goes back to look at the concept of what the high priest was. So the high priest, if you go back into the Old Testament, we see that a high priest was one who was chosen by God. And the first high priest which we find in Exodus chapter 28 and 29. And what we see that Aaron, the brother of Moses, is selected by God as the very first high priest. We see that this was not always a popular thing. We see that Moses' leadership was oftentimes challenged, but also Aaron's leadership as the high priest. This also was challenged. People oftentimes wanted to be priests themselves and wanted to put Aaron to the side. And it's interesting, after the rebellion of Korah, and remember the rebellion of Korah, the earth opens up and people fall in, and God really smacks them pretty good. We see that there is a reaffirmation of Aaron as the high priest. And we're going to actually turn to a passage. So stay in Hebrews, but also turn with me to the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, chapter 17. And as you do so, we see that since the people were still grumbling, God wants to set this all in order, and for once and for all to say Aaron and his lineage will be the high priests. Numbers chapter 17, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and get from them staffs, one for each father's house, from all the chiefs according to their father's houses, 12 staffs. Write each man's name on the staff, and write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi, for there shall be one staff for the head of each father's house. Then you shall deposit them in the tent of the meeting before the testimony, where I will meet with you. And the staff of the man whom I choose shall sprout. Thus I will make to cease from me the grumbling of the people of Israel, which they grumbled against you. Moses spoke to the people of Israel, told them to do this. Go to verse 8. On the next day Moses went into the tent of the testimony, and behold, the staff of Aaron from the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. That's a pretty good trick, is it not? All right. I can see the people there saying, picking almonds off of the staff of Aaron, saying, those are pretty good almonds, man. Maybe some of that smoky flavor, I don't know. But here it is. And here you'll have the definitive choice of God. And God says, Aaron is the man. He's the high priest. You need to make sure that you are following him. Well, that's the historical account of God picking the high priest, Exodus 28, Exodus 29, and then the reaffirmation of Aaron as the high priest, Numbers chapter 17. Yet by the time we get to the century before Christ, and then afterwards, what we have is the high priest turning into a political animal. We see that there is bribery. We see that people are getting that position, getting that post based upon politics. And the Roman government wants a person who is going to side with them on things, so they want a religious ally to help them keep the Jews into order. That's what they want. And so by the time we come to the life of Jesus, what we have is political appointees. Caiaphas is the high priest at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. Caiaphas is the high priest. This is a political animal of a man. This is a man who thinks through things. This is a man who looks for his own benefit. Keep in mind, he is the man who is the high priest, and he is the one who conspires in John chapter 11 to have Jesus crucified. That's how in tune he is with the things of God. So we have here the high priest mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 5. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices. Well, what was the high priest? What was his main job? Well, it was just that. It was to be an intercessor. If you're in the Old Testament economy, you don't have the access that we have today. Look back just one verse. Chapter 4, verse 16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. You don't go in the Old Testament economy, you don't go into the Holy of Holies. Matter of fact, you're struck dead. But because we have Jesus who is our high priest, Jesus who has entered for us, we have access to the throne of grace. That's an amazing statement there. Old Testament economy, you've got to go through somebody else. You have to go through a priesthood. But we, ladies and gentlemen, because we have our high priest, Jesus Christ, we have a direct access to God. In the Old Testament economy, that is not the case. You're going through you have all kinds of priests, and then you have the high priest. And notice here, if you will, chapter 5, verse 1, every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. The word offer here is a present tense, means it's a progressive idea. That means it's an ongoing. Over and over and over and over again, there is the offering of bloody gifts to God, sacrifices to God. Anybody enjoy reading the book of Leviticus? Okay. All right. Some of you might, I don't know, but the book of Leviticus, I find that most people, when they start their Bible reading program, they get through the book of Genesis fine. Everybody does fine with Genesis, right? Everybody does fine with Genesis. In Exodus, not too bad, although the last part of Exodus, you get all of that description on the Aaron's clothing and stuff like that. That gets a little bit numbing, right? And then you get into Leviticus. And Leviticus, you get, this sacrifice and this sacrifice and this sacrifice and this. And it gets a little bit, and I find that most people, they blow up. Okay? They make it through Genesis, they make it through Exodus, but Leviticus is a tough one. You've got daily offerings, offerings for sacrifice, or you have daily offerings, you have offerings in regard to the Sabbath, you have burnt sacrifices, you have peace offerings, you have sin offerings, you have the Day of Atonement, on and on and on and on it goes. It's astounding how many animals die in the sacrificial system. No, really. That's a lot of animals which die. When Solomon is dedicating the temple, okay? So in Solomon, he gets the temple built, and you see it in two different places. You see it in 1 Kings chapter 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7. In both of those places, it talks about the number of animals they kill. It's 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. How do you have time? You must have had a whole groups of people, slit. Look at all the blood. Some of you are grossing out. Yeah, it's kind of gross. It's a bloody, brutal type of thing going on there. And I don't doubt for a moment, they're not just killing the animals and setting them aside. I'm sure they're barbecuing as well, but, think about that, right? It's a celebration, right? So I'm sure they would have taken it to the smoker, but, so they're going to have a celebration, but it's a dedication to the Lord. And so when we consider for a moment all of which takes place, so especially on the Day of Atonement, as the high priest, as he comes in and as he is sacrificing for God on that special day and atoning for the nation, it's an ongoing thing. If you're an old priest, you may be asking yourself, how many animals must be killed? How many animals must be killed? How many animals must be killed? So much so that question is actually brought up in the book of Hebrews. Well, that's the high priest's job. But I'm telling you that there are people, as they're suffering for Jesus, as they've lost family ties, as they've lost financial ties, some of them are saying, you know what, I'd like to go back to those bloody old days with that sacrifice, because perhaps, I might be able to get back with my family. We can go to synagogue together. We can have festivals of the temple together and things. Just the good old days. I just want to go back to the good old days. But folks, with the good old days, they did not have access to God like they do with Jesus Christ. In the good old days, they don't have the Redeemer. There is no going back. Well, some people say, well, one thing that's nice about the high priest is the high priest, at least he can sympathize with this. He can relate to us. And the author writes of this. Verse 2. It says, he, that is the high priest, all the way from Aaron until Caiaphas, He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. Well, there you go. The high priest, he's picked of God, but he is one of us. He's one of our guys. He can be kind to the ignorant. He can be kind to the wayward. He is, the word here, beset, is the word he is cloaked. He is cloaked with weakness. He's cloaked with sin. And because of this, he must go ahead and offer a sacrifice for himself. If you go to the book of Leviticus, once again, Leviticus chapter 9 and verse 7, we see that on the Day of Atonement, that the high priest was to come and he was to make a sacrifice for himself before he made a sacrifice for the assembly as a whole. And our author is saying, you know what? There is something nice about having a high priest. The high priest, he is one of you. He can relate to you. Even if we were to make a small jump and look at leadership in the church today, and you'd say, okay, wouldn't it be nice to have, would you go to a church where you had a pastor where he looked down at his nose and say, oh, you dirty, rotten sinners, can't stand being with you? Now, if I'm that way, you let me know, okay? Am I that way? Okay. You don't want to have somebody who is going to completely lord things over. You don't want somebody who is going to be brutal to you. You don't want that. You want somebody who is sympathetic to you. You do. Ultimately, he finishes up this understanding of the high priesthood under Aaron. He says this. This is his summary. He says, no one takes this honor for himself. Remember, it's chosen by God, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So that's the Aaronic priesthood, right? The Levitical priesthood. That's what you have. And now he's going to give a twist. And in the twist here, he's going to talk about how Jesus is similar, and then he's going to talk about how he is different. That's the old days. The old days of the high priest, and the high priest who had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. He could relate to us, but it's because he was a sinner. And now what we see is we're going to see that there is another high priest who is going to come of a different quality, of a different nature. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest. Aaron didn't exalt himself. Jesus didn't exalt himself, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now we look at this, and if you just do a cursory reading of the New Testament, one of the things which is striking is the humility of Jesus and his lack or his unwillingness to go ahead and to proclaim who he is. Don't you always find that? I always almost get frustrated with Jesus. Jesus, tell him who you are. Show him who you are. I have a friend of mine, he says, when they're mocking Jesus on the cross and spitting at him and saying, hey, come on down, Jesus, and making fun of him, I have a friend of mine, he says, I really wish he'd come down and get him. Okay, that's the Rambo Jesus. Okay, no, we don't have a Rambo Jesus, okay? Jesus came to die, not to execute revenge. So, Jesus, over and over again, though, he defers. The wedding of Cana. And Mary, his mother, says, hey, Jesus, can you do something for us? And he even says to his mother, he says, it's not my time yet. When John the Baptist says, hey, are you the one that we're waiting for? Can you confirm it? Because I'm in jail here, I'm rotting away, and I'd like to know if I'm rotting away for a good purpose or not. And Jesus sends message back to him, and he doesn't say, yes, I am, here's my signature. See, it says Jesus the Messiah. Doesn't do that. All Jesus does is say, tell John these signs. The lame will walk, and the blind can see, and on and on and on it goes. John, you should be able to understand that. Jesus is not going to tout or blow his own horn, but he will point to the evidences that are there. He'll let the evidences speak. If we want to look at one of the more definitive sections is Matthew chapter 3 and verse 17. So I'm going to have you turn there. In Matthew chapter 3 and verse 17, we have the baptism of Jesus. By the by, I've always found it interesting that people don't spend more time contemplating and thinking of why Jesus was baptized. I know why I'm baptized, okay? I get baptized because it represents my death to myself and risen a newness of life, okay? I understand that. I've died to myself in newness of life. I get that. But Jesus isn't being, he's not repenting of his sins. He's being baptized by John. People are coming to John because they would be recognized as repenters. Jesus doesn't have any sins to repent of. Why is Jesus baptized? And I think Jesus is simply baptized, well, not simply, I think Jesus is baptized for a twofold reason. One, to identify with humanity, but second of all, to be identified as the Messiah, that is the Christ, that is the anointed one. Not only is he dipped in the water, but he is also anointed by the Spirit, and the Spirit comes upon him. He is anointed by the Spirit. And I think at this particular point, this is where, boom, the ministry is beginning. Look at Matthew chapter 3 and verse 17. Oh, we need to pick it up before that. Go to 3:13. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, but do you come to me? But Jesus answered, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. That's a little cryptic. Then he consented. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Very, very similar to the psalm which is quoted here. We go back to Psalm chapter 2 and verse 7. That's the psalm which is quoted in Hebrews, and it speaks of the Son. You are my Son. Today I have begotten you. That's Psalm 2 and verse 7. And what we have here is we have the affirmation it's showing that Jesus is the Christ. He is the anointed one. We also get another psalm, Psalm 114 or 110 verse 4. You are a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And some of you are saying, about time you got to Melchizedek, because I want to know all about this guy. Right? Some of you have that on your list. Okay, figure out the Melchizedek thing. Another sermon, another day. No, I'm serious. You're like, that's cheating. No, it's not cheating. In chapter 7, he talks about Melchizedek and a lot more. So he's going to mention it twice today, and I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to do what the writer of Hebrews did. The writers of Hebrews wrote about Melchizedek twice in this section. And then he says, and by the way, I'll finish it up in chapter 7. You're going to have to wait. First Baptist University Place, you get to wait. Neener. All right. But I will tell you the point of it. Why does he bring this up? He brings this up because he wants to bring up the fact that Jesus is not part of of Aaron's lineage. He wants to bring it up that he is a qualitative difference there. He is not just the latest high priest, a descendant of Aaron. No, he is of a different quality. Okay? And so that's the important part there. All right. So again, he talks about, let's try to map this out. When we map this out, we have this understanding that there is a high priest, okay, in Aaron's line, and we see that he offers lots of sacrifices. We see that he is sympathetic. Now all of a sudden we're going to see that Jesus also is a high priest, and we're going to see now he is sympathetic. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. What we have here is we have this statement that Jesus is very sympathetic to us. Listen, the high priest in Jerusalem did not know every person that came. Didn't know them all. No way. I am here to tell you that Jesus knows every one of your names. And when Jesus is praying and when Jesus is beseeching the Father, we are told that he doesn't do it in a passionless way. He does it in an extremely, excruciatingly passionate way. In the days of his flesh, that is, in the days of his weakness in the incarnation, Jesus offered up prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him. I think this is probably referring more than likely to the scene which we find in the Garden of Gethsemane. So if you'll turn one more time, the book of Luke, chapter 22. Luke 22 and verse 39.
And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw. And he knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove the cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." The cup here is the cup of the wrath of God. If I don't have to drink it, I don't want to drink it. If it's at all possible, let this go away. The answer is not directly given to us, but by Jesus' actions we know that he must drink it. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven strengthening him, and being in agony he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise, pray, that you may not enter into temptation." Here we have Christ, and he is praying, if there's any way possible, if there's another way, let it pass. It's always interesting to me when people tell me, they say, "Well, there's lots of ways to heaven." I'm sorry, but that's not true. If there was another way to enter into glory, then Jesus would not have died upon the cross. He would not have had to have drunk that cup. He would not have had to have drank the wrath of God. But he did. If there was another way, the Father said, "Oh, now that you mention it, there is one." The high priest didn't know everybody who came. He didn't know most of the people that came. Jesus knows us all. Even when Jesus is being taken to the cross, he begins to intercede for people as they begin to nail him to the boards. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." We come back to Hebrews then. In the days of his flesh, in the days of his weakness, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Now, some people look at that and they say, "Well, Jesus' prayers didn't do much good." Here's Jesus, and he's praying to him who can save him from death. He's praying to the Father, and what good did that do him? Because it didn't save him from his death. No. Jesus was not saved from dying, but he was saved from death. Jesus died, but he did not remain in the realm of death, for Jesus rose again. If you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, if you don't believe in the resurrection of Christ, you are not a Christian. It is a fundamental understanding of what Jesus did. He died and then he rose again. You have to have all of that as the gospel. We do not serve a dead Savior, we serve a living Lord. Verse 8, "And although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him." We look at this, and again, some people struggle with this. They say, "Wait a second. How is it that Jesus could learn if he is, if he's God? How is it that Jesus can be made perfect? Is there something wrong with him? Is he defective?" And again, so many people will pick these small pieces out and they say, "Well, there's a problem here." But Jesus does learn in a sense, in that he experientially goes through the difficulty. Jesus knows what it's like to suffer, just as the people here, the audience, they know what it's like to suffer. Jesus knows even more so what it's like to suffer. Jesus was made perfect, is what it says here a little bit later on. What does that mean that he's made perfect? Well, does that mean that he was imperfect before? No, it means that he is made complete as the priest. The word perfect here is the same word for completeness. He was made complete as the priest. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. We are told in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15 that Jesus has no sin. There's no imperfection there, but he has become the perfect high priest. And now he has come, and he is the source. He has come to offer himself. Let's cheat a little bit. I keep on talking about Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to look at one verse in Hebrews 7. In Hebrews 7 and verse 27, when there is a contrast again about the high priest, we'll pick it up in verse 26. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer daily sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once and for all when he offered up himself. Jesus not only is the high priest, but he also is the sacrifice. Oh, the good old days. The good old days when we could go ahead and we could offer sheep and goats and bulls and pigeons and animal after bloody animal after bloody animal after bloody animal. And then we got to go ahead and we got to have family dinners, and that was all fine and dandy. Understand what we have in Jesus Christ. We have access to God. We get to go into the Holy of Holies. We can speak directly to him. We don't need any other intercessor. We have Christ. We have a Christ who is not indifferent towards us. We have a priest who is not ignorant of our names, but one who knows our names. Again, it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, it's back in the day. No. We need to appreciate what Christ has done, understand that he has given us a future. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. The response is a faithful obedience of Christ, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Once again, you get that Melchizedek, and you say, what is that all about? Once again, very briefly, because we're not going to belabor it today, but it has the idea that Jesus is not, once again, of the Levitical background. He's not of the Aaronic priesthood. He rather is of a different order. Okay? Everything else is a foreshadowing of what Christ is. William Lane writes it this way: Christ enjoys a preeminence that removes him from the sphere of comparison with Aaron. He was without sin, Hebrews 4:15. He is summoned to be a priest forever, 5:6. His priestly task is to create an order of salvation that is valid forever, chapter 5, verse 9, which has the effect of rendering the Aaronic institution obsolete. We don't need to look back to dead animals. We don't need to look back to those old sacrifices. We have a Christ who died for us. We have a Christ who rose for us. We have a Christ who lives for us, and we have a Christ who intercedes for us even now. There is no going back. In your Christian life, as followers of Jesus now, perhaps you have come from a difficult or challenging background, and God has saved you from that. But perhaps that history, as you have let the years go by, is once again appealing, and you're trying to think, maybe I should go back to that. Go back to the good old days. Don't be so foolish. Don't be like the children of Israel who said, let's go back to Egypt. Do not gloss over things with your nostalgia. Appreciate what Christ has done. Move forward with the understanding that he is your Lord. We don't know exactly when the book of Hebrews was written. We don't know exactly even where the audience was at. Some people believe that the audience is in Palestine. Some people believe that they're in Rome. We're not answering that question today. One thing I think we can be very confident in is that this was written, however, before AD 66. Because in AD 66, the Romans move in. And by the time we get to AD 70, the great temple is torn to pieces. It is torn to pieces, and there's nothing left. If you are somebody and you're reading the book of Hebrews, and it's before the destruction of the temple, you're like, wow, this is hard stuff. I don't know if I can accept it. But by the time you get to AD 70, guess what? There definitely is no going back. Do you know that even today there is no daily sacrifice? There is no day of atonement per se. Not all the sacrificial system. Why? Because there's no temple left. We have our high priest, and he has already given himself as the high priest, given himself as the sacrificed. That's all we need. Move forward with Jesus Christ in our new year. Move forward with confidence, and don't look back, even if the nostalgia is fun.